So, right, we've just started. So, let me give you a little bit of context on me and what we do. So, I run a bridging gap organisation called Remote Inclusion, and the whole purpose of our initiative is that we are trying to help disabled candidates, people with chronic illnesses, single parents, people who can't work regular 9 to 5 jobs. We help them find fully remote work through our employment agencies. And I've been reaching out to many people, such as yourself, so we can create some informal conversations, so we can create a network. Because I do believe in the initiative that we've got going, and I really want to help people as much as we can. So that's just a little bit of context on what we do and what remote inclusion is. I just want to know a little bit more about you and what it is you do. So what led you to start a SIC? I want to know a little bit more about you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I set up SIC 5 years ago now, which feels like crazy, to be honest. So originally it was myself and a co-founder, and basically both of us had been finding lots of challenges when it came to the workplace. So, like, for example, I'd been in 11 different jobs in the space of 9 years, and often that was because I was deemed as really high risk. I was always being like overlooked for promotion, and I always really wanted to go self-employed, and effectively I was in a job I really hated and was like, okay, I'm going to go self-employed. And I'm a marketer by trade, so I set myself up as a marketing freelancer, and SIC, my social enterprise, was effectively just a bit of a side project.
A little side hustle.
Yeah, it was literally like, oh, this would be like a nice sort of like hobby to do alongside my marketing freelance. But it quite quickly sort of grew into something that couldn't just be a side hustle. So now there are sort of two sides to the business, really. So one side is all around supporting disabled, neurodivergent, chronically ill people at any stage of their career, really. So we have drop-in career clinics, which are free and online and run once a month, and they're a way of people just sort of accessing community support in a really informal setting. And then whenever we have sort of the funding to do so, we do sort of like cohort-based learning opportunities, which are usually for people that are un or underemployed. And then on the flip side, we work directly with businesses as consultants around access and inclusion. And obviously that then helps us to kind of fund the other side of the business, which is why the CIC model sort of like specifically works for us, really, because it's not just about consulting on businesses around how to do better, but on the flip side, it's also around supporting people directly, because I think it's a sort of two-pronged issue, really. There's not the support out there, but then there's also not necessarily that many employers that are sort of willing to sort of do the right thing, although I do think that that is growing. But yeah, I mean, from my point of view, I'd done a lot of work within sort of equity, diversity and inclusion, but actually never really drawn on my lived experience. So I was born with a respiratory condition that's meant I spent my life on immunosuppressing drugs. It meant that during the pandemic I was shielding, and it, you know, has meant that throughout my career I've taken a lot of sick days, and you know, just what you were saying about remote work. Obviously, for me, remote work is incredibly beneficial because I don't have a working immune system. So being in offices, I've never actually experienced so few sick days as since kind of since the pandemic, really, because I get to work from home, which is like amazing. But that would have helped me so much earlier on in my career as just a really simple adjustment.
Yeah.
And not being exposed to everything that
No, I can
everyone
imagine.
else experiences.
Yeah. No, I can imagine. So I think that just, I mean, that kind of like sheds light on like a lot of topics that it gets overlooked when it comes to employment. So what do you think then employers still misunderstand mostly like about disability and neurodiversity within the workplace? Because clearly there's a lot. If I understand that they want us to come into work and put our hours in, which is absolutely fine, but the candidates that they're hiring, the kind of work structure they want, it doesn't actually work for them. So what would you say that's like quite a big misunderstanding that employers have with these types of candidates?
I think the cost is always a huge thing from an employer point of view. There's a fear that this employee is going to cost us a lot of money because they're going to take a lot of sick days, and actually making accommodations is going to cost us a lot of money. And I think actually so many reasonable adjustments are free or incredibly low cost to implement, and can be super simple. Things like working from home, things like having flexible hours. And I think as well there's a bit of a misunderstanding sometimes with flexible hours, that has to mean that somebody can work absolutely any hours. You can implement things like core working hours, which I personally think can be quite practical, because then it makes having things like virtual meetings so much easier. But actually so many things that make the biggest difference are relatively cheap. I'm also neurodivergent, and one of the things I've always really struggled with is spelling and grammar. So I have Grammarly Premium, which is paid for by Access to Work, but actually it's only £120 a year. So from an employer point of view, that's, as soon as you're an employer that's got sort of, say, 10, 20 employees, that cost is next to nothing. But, on the flip side, there are things like Access to Work as well, which, don't get me wrong, is a really not great program at the moment, but it is still supporting so many people into work.
Yeah.
So, I think it's that cost thing that's always the biggest, whereas actually, countering that, once disabled neurodivergent people have adjustments in place, they're actually much less likely to take sick days than other colleagues. They're also more likely to stay longer in a role when they're being supported. So things like recruitment costs can actually be reduced. But I think there's always that assumption for an employer that, this is going to cost us a lot of money and we can't afford to do that, whereas actually 9 times out of 10 it's going to cost virtually nothing.
Yeah. So from your experience then, what would you say like the biggest barriers are that people with disabilities or people with chronic illnesses or neurodiversity people face trying to access employment? What would you say?
I think bias is one of the biggest things. So there's loads of stats that show that disabled people spend 60% more time applying for jobs. They apply for I can't remember the figures, but they apply for a hell of a lot more jobs than non-disabled people. Loads of disabled people have done that sort of experiment of, if I disclose and apply for a job versus if I don't disclose and apply for a job, what happens? But I do think that there are schemes that can be kind of used to our advantage. So things like disability confident, for example, you know, if an employer is disability confident, they might not necessarily be living and breathing those values. They might not necessarily have kind of rolled down all the elements of disability confidence across the organisation. But sometimes I've advised people in their applications to actually be really, really clear and say, you know, I know that you're a disability confident employer as an autistic person who meets your minimum criteria. I look forward to meeting you at interview, and to be honest, it has worked quite a few times for people. So sometimes you've just got to actually really reflect back to an employer, you know, these are the values that you have, these are the schemes that you are part of, and therefore as a disabled person I'm going to sort of point that out to you and try and guarantee myself an interview. But yeah, I mean, unfortunately, there is still a lot of bias. I think a lot of employers are getting a lot better, and larger employers are going to be soon needing to do disability pay gap reporting, which I think will help them actually just get an overview of how many disabled people they actually have in their organisation more than anything. But I do think as well it will just start to kind of open up those conversations, because it's a huge portion of the workforce. And actually, when employers and companies are more diverse, they tend to perform better, actually. So yeah, there are big advantages to it as well, as much as anything else.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's pros and cons to everything, isn't there? I think with that being said, then would you say that there's attitudes have been changed towards remote work or flexible work, or would you say that's improved in the last few years, or do you think there's still like a pretty long way to go?
I do think it has got better than it had ever been at any point in my career. So, for example, I was working for an organisation like in the first few months of the pandemic, and previously when I'd asked for remote work, that had always been poo-pooed, and then all of a sudden everybody was remote working, and all of a sudden sort of everyone had to trust that people were just sort of getting on with their work.
Yeah.
So I actually think, you know, that did create a massive shift. I think, unfortunately, though, a lot of organisations have started doing quite a lot of return to office stuff, which does feel a bit like a step backwards. However, I do think that at the very least, when it comes to reasonable adjustments and remote working, there's a lot more openness to it, and there's a lot less of that assumption that somebody's just not doing the job. There's a lot more trust in terms of actually people are getting the outcomes, which is really, really good. I don't think we're at a perfect point, because, you know, as you've said with the work that you do, it's not just around disabled people, it's around people with caring responsibilities, for example, who within the sort of social model of disability would be considered to have that sort of disabling impact of society. And, you know, remote working can be a huge thing for those people. And, you know, I think it can be quite difficult now in organisations that have those sort of mandatory return to offices to kind of make that case. However, I do think, just on the complete flip side, you know, there's been so much more discourse around flexible working. There's been so much more discourse around pay gap reporting, that, you know, the employers that want to sort of showcase that they're doing the right thing, I think, are going to be a lot more open to remote work than they've ever been before. So I'm hopeful that there are going to be changes, and I definitely think there has been massive changes over the last 5, 6, 7 years that have actually been positive. And I just hope we don't take too many sort of steps backwards, really.
Well, I think just by that, from what you've just said, remote work really, if we're being honest, it only really came to light during COVID because of the pandemic, because people had no choice but to work from home because no one was, we couldn't go into the office, everyone was self-isolating. And it wasn't really, remote work before that was never really looked, well, was not really considered, whether that be from a disabled person or for anyone, really. It was only because of COVID where people were doing the exact same job they were doing in the office, just at home. So really there wasn't an incentive for people to go back to work, when it's like, well, I can do the exact same job that I'm doing from the comfort of my own home. So what's the point of actually going back to the office? But with that being said, though, what types of employers would you think or tend to be the most open to inclusive hiring practice? Because even now, now the pandemic's over, it's like, okay, well, pandemic's over, we can go back to normality, but normality now is remote work, because they can do that exact same job at home. There isn't really much difference other than productivity is what, from an employer's perspective, is what they would deem as why they want people into the office. It comes under productivity, but if the job is still getting done, why can't people just do remote work? So that's why, So what types of employers would you tend to be most inclusive to hiring practices?
But it's really difficult, because obviously when we're talking about remote work, we're mainly talking about desk-based work. And obviously there are roles that just aren't feasible to be remote, especially in things like healthcare, for example. There are a lot of roles that remote working opportunities are really, really limited. But I think it really, really varies. So, for example, I've done quite a lot of work within the games industry, and therefore a lot of their teams are designers, developers, etc. And they seem to be, in general, very, very open to remote work. Quite a lot of them have actually kind of closed their core offices and maybe opened a smaller office, for example, because they're very aware that actually it's saving them money to not have this sort of permanent office that fits every single member of staff. But obviously in sort of broader tech, you've got sort of Google, Meta, etc., all having these quite strict return to office mandates, especially over in the US. So it's quite interesting, really, because those sort of like tech roles, it seems to have gone one of two ways. I think a lot of companies that have a nationwide presence are really open to remote working, because they've got colleagues working in Glasgow who are working with colleagues in Devon or whatever, and does it make any difference if those people are in an office? No, because they're not working necessarily with their teams. So I think that can sometimes be something to sort of look out for when it comes to, is this employer going to be open to remote working? But I think it's really difficult in terms of there's not really a hard and fast rule. I've seen, sort of creative agencies being incredibly pro-remote working, and virtually identical companies being very keen on sort of 4 days in the office and just 1 day remote. And I think it's really interesting because you do see that people effectively move from one to the other because they prefer the other one's way of working, and they prefer that flexibility. But yeah, I think it's really, really difficult to say, oh, this industry is doing this across the board, because I think it's certainly within sort of SMEs in particular, where the leadership is often a founder, that it's that person's opinion quite often that has the biggest impact. If that person is very set in their ways when it comes to office-based work, that is going to have an impact on sort of that company culture, even if it's a company of 500, 600, 700 people. I think when you get to the larger organizations, those large enterprises, I think it sometimes maybe depends a bit more on who your line manager is, as opposed to any opinion from kind of higher up. Although I would say it does seem to be that those large organizations seem to still have a lot of people who are working fully remotely. And when it comes to SMEs, there tends to be a bit of a split almost down the middle, really. And it seems to be like very different camps. But yeah, I think it's hard to kind of pick like a industry that is doing it across the board. It's not something I've necessarily come across. But yeah, I do think once organisations are maybe disability confident, or maybe they're going for B Corp, quite often they're maybe a little bit more flexible and open. And from really small micro organisations like mine, I mean, the thought of opening an office is a massive expense. So it's sort of like, well, we're working remotely, everyone.
Well, yeah, it's that incentive was like, okay, well, if we've bought an office, the whole idea is that we want people to be occupying that space, because there isn't a point of having an office. But I'm talking mainly from an inclusion perspective now. If like when employers say they want to improve inclusion, where do you think they struggle in practice, or just from like experience, or from what you've seen, or even not seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes there is a real difficulty in engaging remote teams when you've got an in-person team as well. So I do often say, where possible, it can be really beneficial to come together like once a year, twice a year, for example, to sort of encourage those conversations. And, to put things in place to try and make that as feasible as possible for people that are mainly remote. So thinking about, travel costs, thinking about accessibility, thinking about all of those elements. I mean, even thinking about things like childcare, what are the logistics that you kind of pull this? And I do think there is always going to be that slight conflict of people that are remote versus people that are office workers, and not necessarily building that sort of same rapport. But I do think that can be on leaders around thinking about ways to then build that rapport. So when you're doing something social, for example, how can you engage remote teams? So could you have like a remote games night, or could you all learn a skill together, or do a book club, or there are so many things you can do to kind of engage that social element. And don't get me wrong, you will get remote workers who don't want to engage in any of that, but I do think it's worth trying to ensure that as much as possible, exclusion is sort of minimized, and thinking of ways to build that. But I do think, that is always going to be the challenge for employers, is kind of building that level of inclusion for people when it comes to remote work. But I do think there are employers that are doing it really, really well. I've seen employers, for example, who have some of their online meetings where people are allowed to sort of go on walks outside in nature while that's happening, so they can just dial in from their phone rather than need to be on camera, etc. Things like book clubs, regular sort of well-being and learning opportunities, and all of those things can make such a huge difference.
Yeah, I mean, it does just kind of tie into the whole like inclusivity, is to make them feel included as well. So just from that, then I'm talking like from remote inclusion's perspective now. So from your perspective, so where do you think then remote inclusion could add the most value in this space to make people feel inclusive?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's around kind of removing those fears that employers have around getting it wrong, or taking on an employee that they sort of initially deem as probably higher risk. And it's trying to remove those fears as much as possible. So it's an education piece as much as anything, really, for from an employer point of view. And then I think from the employee point of view, it's around potentially like building and strengthening those online communities. So giving those opportunities for maybe things like online networking, for example, where people can kind of share their experiences of being a remote employee, and sharing those those ideas, those things that have worked for them, those best practices from within their employer. And I think it's giving that space for people to sort of share and learn, really.
Yeah, I mean, with that being said, then would you say then, how do I want to word this? I mean, because you talk a lot about space and the actual space itself, but even if people were working from home, that's their own space. So how do you incorporate that with a work life structure?
In terms of the networking piece,
Yeah,
I mean, I think it's providing things like online drop-ins, for example, that maybe kind of fit in with sort of lunch times or evenings, for example, and having a bit of a play around with what works for the most people.
yeah,
But having it as something quite sort of flexible, easy to access, etc., I think can be a really good way of engaging people. I mean, we do our online career clinics, and they're once a month, and we found that they work best over a sort of lunchtime. And we found that, over the years, people have dropped in with all kinds of challenges. I mean, obviously they are not remote work focused, but those that join those sessions who are in work tend to be, definitely tend to be remote workers, or at least working from home that day.
yeah. Well, the only reason why I asked that is because I think a big thing that employers find or are struggling with at the minute, and this doesn't just go for people with remote work, this is just a general thing altogether. I think retention when it comes to hiring someone is a very big problem at the minute, because people are hiring many people for the same role, and it will last, that the retention span will be from around 3 to 6 months, and employers are losing money by having to constantly rehire someone for the same role. And especially when it comes to disabled candidates or people who can't work that kind of be in that working structure or that work culture, it's all good for them to hire them, but then the actual infrastructure of the building, or the fact that they do want them in the office, that doesn't actually work for our candidates. So then that it's all about, okay, it's a retention thing. So one thing with remote inclusion, we provide ongoing support for not just employers but the candidates too, not just before the hiring stage but also after. So where I'm going with this is essentially, in terms of retention, how would you say, and you can answer this from both an employer and a candidate perspective, where are people going wrong, or what could you say could be improved to help that retention span?
Yeah, I mean, I think from an employer point of view, it's understanding what adjustments somebody needs. And I do think often there's an assumption from an employer point of view that somebody's going to know what adjustments they need. And especially when somebody's earlier in their career or had a career gap, for example, they're probably not going to know. So the things that tend to really help is starting to kind of build a little bit of a menu of adjustments that have maybe worked for other colleagues, or simply, for example, on the ACAS website, there is a massive list of adjustments with some suggestions as to who these specific adjustments might help. But I think absolutely it's spending the time to maybe say to a person, okay, well, you might not be sure exactly what adjustments might help you, so maybe let's try these 3 adjustments this month, and and if they work, great. But if not, we might try another 3 adjustments the following month. Because getting to a point where, from both the employer and the employee's point of view, you know what adjustments are going to work, can be the biggest difference, because once somebody has the adjustments in place that they really need, and yeah, that will probably change over time, but just for that sort of period of time can be a huge thing when it comes to retention, because that person is being supported. And yeah, it's a bit of a trial and error. It's very rare that somebody comes in and they go, oh yeah, these are the 4 adjustments that I need to succeed in this role. And I mean, if you do get that, brilliant, take the opportunity to get those adjustments in place as soon as possible. And by that, I mean within a fast timeline, not taking as soon as possible to mean sort of 6 months down the line. That can make a huge difference when it comes to retention. And then I do think, just on top of that, it's thinking about those additional things, thinking about creating a safe space for people, thinking about overall employee well-being, thinking about just how to create a supportive environment for employees. Not necessarily just remote workers, not necessarily just disabled workers, but just thinking about everybody as a whole, because I know that retention can be a real challenge for organisations, regardless of who the employees are. And I do think as well, just to add to that, I think COVID did have quite a big impact on company culture, in terms of companies kind of maybe having a bit of an identity crisis when it comes to company culture, that I think even now we're still seeing the effects of. So it's also, from an employer point of view, spending a bit of time actually digging into, what is our company culture? How can we improve it? How can we really embed employee well-being into that? And making that really, really clear from the very beginning as to who you are as an employer, because I think when there's that sort of bit of identity crisis around the employer brand, maybe being a pre-pandemic employer brand that was done in, say, 2019, somebody applying for a role based on that, and then actually that not being their reality now, can cause like a huge disconnect between employee and employer, and it's around actually making sure that, you know, you are kind of living the values and that you are presenting them outwards. Because similarly, your 2019 employer identity could have changed a lot for the better, and actually you're missing out on candidates because you're still kind of presenting a version of yourself as an employer that doesn't exist.
You know, you just touched on something. I think when you, in terms of like, you kind of have to look at it as like they're two different like entities almost, because it's very much, you've got a 2019 employer, you've got a 2026 employer, and they are two very, very, very different, even though it's not a massive time span between the years. In terms of what employment was like prior to COVID and what it is now, the way everything's changed in terms of work culture, work structure, like the demands from a job role altogether, they are completely changed. And it is very, you can identify someone who is kind of working from like a pre-2019 mentality in comparison to someone who's working from a post-2019 mentality. You just kind of like, you touched on something there. So
yeah, and I also think, especially sometimes, like I've had this before, where if it's an international company, everything that is presented out to candidates will quite often come from a very head office perspective, whereas actually often the local business is again quite different. So again, it's making sure that there's that match in sort of expectations and reality, because, you know, that can be a huge thing when somebody joins an organization, they think, oh yeah, these are all of their values, and then, you know, a few months down the line they start going, oh well, I thought those were their values, and then they kind of dig a little bit more, and that just then leads to a real disconnect and often really high turnover rates.
Well, I mean, that's what we're trying to really fix. I feel like it's a very broken part of the employment system. So the idea with remote inclusion, that it's a bridging gap. So we're trying to fix that part of the employment system where I feel like it has kind of disconnected a little bit, because things have gone back to normal, the work life and working structure has changed, and it's either you have to move with it, or we end up going backwards, and that's where I find that disconnect is. So would you say then, because I mean you've covered all my questions, so I'm pretty much that's all my questions done. So could you see then a collaboration with SICK and remote inclusion, because I feel like there's a lot of alignment between the two, in what we're both trying to put out there. So
definitely, like we'd love to learn more and collab, and I'm always very kind of open to chats, conversations, collaboration. I always think it's really beneficial, so definitely.
Do you have like any organizations that you work with, or charities or people, because right now our main goal is to create candidates, which is why we're creating I'm making all these informal conversations, and I want to post it all to our social media so we can actually create a network. So are there people where we can that you could introduce us to, where we could find candidates to introduce this model to? And I'm happy to say that, like, we've spoken to you, we've spoken with SICK, and have used almost as a face of our business almost.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously we sometimes have candidates ourselves, but some good organisations that I would recommend are probably Radical Recruit, who are a really fab organisation that are supporting people sort of furthest away from the workplace. They're always great. And then I guess as well there are sort of various job boards. So Even Break is a massive disability jobs board, and there's also one called Patchwork Hub. But yeah, that was probably my start of 10.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Well, I really appreciate the time that you've taken to speak to me today. Like I said, very, very greatly appreciated. So thank you so much.
Lovely to meet you, Nikki.